Dr. Harold Perl is the chief of the Prevention Research Branch at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Today he joins us to discuss the valuable findings of his research as it pertains to prevention and addiction.
Thank you, Art. I appreciate the chance to be here.
Dr. Perl, what is prevention as it pertains to drug abuse?
Well, prevention in drug abuse is really two things. One is delaying the onset or the initiation of using drugs for the first time, and it's also preventing the progression to more abusive use, to more intense addiction later in life.
How does this scientific research benefit professionals in the medical and treatment fields?
Well, clinicians, people in the medical profession, or counselors that interact with people every day might notice different behaviors or might notice that problems are occurring. And so part of their screening and prevention activities is to notice these issues as they start to appear and then try and figure out what's the best kind of action to take, whether it's treatment, whether it's education, whether it's working with families or schools or communities. So prevention really cuts across all those places. It takes place in schools, it's involved with families, it's involved in communities, and it's involved on the individual level as well.
Can you explain research implementation science to us?
And implementation science is really the systematic study of how best to translate scientific evidence into ways and practical uses that people can put to use in their communities and in their families and their practice. So it's been less attended to, I think, for a long time, but in the past 15 or 20 years, there's been a lot of study and a lot of people working in the field to try and figure out how best to take scientific answers and put them into practice. And you know, the standard thought is that it takes 17 years for a scientific finding to be really well used in routine practice. And if that's true, it's way too long. We need to find ways that shorten that process. Implementation science is one way of doing that.
Dr. Perl, can you provide us with some strategies for families, schools, communities that will foster an effective approach towards recovery?
Well, that's really looking at prevention along a number of levels. There's prevention that occurs early on, maybe a universal prevention, which means that you have a program that impacts everybody in a community or everybody in a school, even if they don't have any problems right now. But it's a way of reducing the risk factors for later addiction or later drug abuse problems, or increasing the protective factors that will enhance their ability to really cope with stress and to resist the lure of drugs. So that's the first level. The second level is if there are signs of problems, then you can have what's called a selected intervention, where people who have a risk or are at high risk for potential high risk for whatever factors, personal factors or environmental factors, to really have an intervention to help them, again, resist the difficulties that drug use might present. And then the third level is indicated prevention, which means somebody who's already showing signs, and that gets more to the question you're asking, already showing signs of some problems and want to do a more intensive, targeted intervention for them right then and there.
Dr. Perl, are there any recommendations you can make to bridge the gap or maybe improve communication between your research findings and the practice of physicians and clinicians who are treating persons suffering from addictions?
It's really a two-part system to translate research findings into really effective practice in the community, in the real world, like we like to say, and the implementation and adoption of these evidence-based findings. And the responsibility falls on both ends. One is a responsibility of the researchers and the investigators to do a number of things. One is to try and answer the questions that are important in real life, that are important for physicians, for clinicians, for practitioners, for families and communities to know the answers to. So we've got to ask the right questions. And then we need to figure out how to get those answers translated in a way that people can use. So it's one thing to do a study and publish in a scholarly journal, but that's not far enough. You've got to really know how to take those findings and explain them in a way so that people can use them in a very practical, very hands-on manner. So part of that responsibility is on the scientist, to get those answers out in a way that people can use them. The other half of the responsibility is the practitioners, the clinicians, physicians, counselors, psychologists, families, community leaders, policymakers, to be open and receptive to understanding that science has some answers that they can use. Part of it is recognizing the problem, and I think it's easy to recognize the problem. We see it around us all the time, and people are focused on problems as they come up, and often there's an event or a crisis or a tragedy that really awakens us to the nature and the extent of the problem. And then the community and the families and the practitioners need to be ready to take the answers that scientists have to offer and try and use them in a way that is consistent with what the science has found. So you can adopt, and you can try and adapt it a little bit to the specifics of your community, and that's important to do. But it's also important not to stray too far from what the intervention actually was tested to do.
Dr. Perl, why is prevention so important?
Well, prevention is important because if you try and treat everybody who's got a problem, you'll never catch up. There will never be enough people, and there's a lot of dedicated people out there, but there'll never be enough people to help everybody who's got a problem fully. The only way to get a handle on it is to stop people from having problems in the first place. So imagine you're fishing along a river, you and your best friend, and it's a wonderful day and it's sunny and you're having a great time, and all of a sudden you hear screaming and splashing, and there's a baby floating down the river, sputtering and crying, half drowning. Of course you pull the baby out. Who wouldn't do that? And you put the baby aside and get him or her safe on shore, and you look up again, and there's another baby and a kid floating down the river, splashing, spluttering, drowning. You pull them out. You do that 3 or 4 times, and all of a sudden your friend starts running upriver, and you say, "Where are you going? What are you doing?" He says, "I'm going to find out who's throwing all these babies in the river and stop them." That's prevention. That's why prevention is important. We can't spend all our time trying to pull the babies out of the river. We need to find a way to keep them from falling in.
We'd like to thank Dr. Perl for sharing the findings of his research as it pertains to prevention science and addiction. Up next, we revisit the ACEs project in our archive segment. Stay tuned.